We carry the arrogance of acceleration. You do, I do, we all do. We live in a world defined by the half-life of technology. If a phone is older than 3 years, it's a relic. If a car doesn't have autonomous braking, it's practically antique. We are so utterly convinced that progress is linear, that speed is inevitable, that we forget the terrifying truth. The deepest history of our species is not a graph of constant upward movement, but a vast, silent, flat-line plateau. We are talking about a time when the very mechanism of human curiosity simply seized up. Look at the history we usually celebrate. We talk about the agricultural revolution, the birth of cities, the sudden leap into bronze and iron. These are blips. They are brief, bright flares of intellectual energy on a timeline that is otherwise dominated by darkness, not darkness defined by lack of light, but by lack of change. We tend to focus on the 3,000 years that built Western civilization, but what about the 10,000 years that came right before it? The 10,000 years where nothing functionally changed. You have to understand the scale of this intellectual silence. Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing the world is locked down, not politically, but technologically. The tools you use, the materials you interact with, the structure of your life, they are the permanent ceiling. Your great-grandchildren will inherit the exact same technologies, the exact same challenges, the exact same solutions for 300 generations. That is the nightmare our ancestors lived through. We often credit our ancient ancestors with incredible ingenuity, and they deserve it. Around 40,000 to 20,000 years ago, during the Upper Paleolithic, the human mind was running wild. We mastered fire management. We developed tailored clothing. We invented the spear thrower, the atlatl, a tool that radically changed our hunting efficiency. We were dynamic, migratory, and relentlessly innovative because the world demanded it. The Ice Age was a harsh tutor, forcing us to solve new problems constantly. Then the world changed its curriculum. The great ice sheets receded, the climate stabilized, and the megafauna began to vanish. The harsh, dynamic landscape that forced innovation was replaced by something else entirely: comfort. We call this period the Mesolithic, or the Archaic period in the Americas. And if you are an archaeologist digging up sites from this long, sprawling epoch, which spans roughly 15,000 years ago down to the advent of farming, you find something chilling. You find repetition. The evidence is in the lithics. Stone tools are the ultimate signature of human thought. They are the frozen algorithms of ancient efficiency. Before the Mesolithic, if you tracked a human band moving across the landscape over 200 years, you would see refinement, new materials, and specialized shapes emerging. The toolkits would adapt, but now you find the same projectile points, the same basic scrapers, the same groundstone implements repeated, generation after generation, across vast geographic distances and immense spans of time. The spear tip made by a hunter in 10,000 BC is virtually indistinguishable from the spear tip ground out by his distant descendant in 5,000 BC. No one, anywhere, figured out a better angle, a lighter handle, or a stronger binding method. The engine of progress didn't just slow down, it seized. Why? The standard, sanitized narrative, the one that absolves our ancestors of blame, says they were busy rebuilding after the Ice Age. They were too focused on survival. That narrative is deeply misleading. Because for many populations, survival suddenly became remarkably easy. Think about where people settled during this era of deep silence. They weren't fighting glaciers anymore. They were moving into the newly temperate zones, coastal areas, river valleys, and especially forested environments, newly rich in resources. These environments weren't challenging in the way the open, cold steppes had been. They were bountiful. This is the true horror story of human intelligence. The greatest enemy of invention is not grinding poverty or existential threat. It is predictable, sufficient stability. We are going to define a specific environment, an invisible antagonist that acted like a historical anchor, preventing humanity from launching into the next phase of its existence. We are going to call it the Valley of Delay. This wasn't one single spot on the map, but a complex biological and environmental condition, a perfect, subtle trap. Imagine for a moment that you live in a coastal settlement. The climate is stable. The forests provide firewood and shelter. You don't need to migrate hundreds of miles following massive, unpredictable herds. You can reliably harvest mollusks and fish from the shore. You can gather nuts and berries in season. You have access to small game that is easy to catch with standard snares and nets. The life is hard by modern standards, yes, but it is predictable. If you need a tool to split wood, the simplest, most efficient axe you invented 5 millennia ago still works perfectly fine. If you spend 3 weeks grinding a new axe head that is marginally sharper, what does that effort actually buy you? Maybe 5 extra minutes of leisure time per year. The environment had provided a perfect equation. The effort required for profound innovation vastly outweighed the immediate, meager benefit. The Valley of Delay was not characterized by scarcity, but by surplus, a reliable, moderate surplus that demanded nothing more than routine. It was the place where humanity settled into its biological comfort zone and forgot how to dream up necessity. And this valley, this geographical trap, spanned the globe, but held one particular, critical region in its grip longer and tighter than any other. A region that possessed the highest density of human population, the best access to water, and the most abundant natural resources in the known world. It was the cradle of future civilization, but for 10,000 years it was also the intellectual prison. The trap was comfort, the cage was abundance, and we were locked inside, watching the millennia drift by, perfectly content with the tools we already held. We were ready for the next great leap, but the environment was whispering, "Why bother?" We need to understand how we finally escaped this prison, and why this specific valley, with its immense, predictable bounty, held the key to both our imprisonment and our eventual breakout. Because when the walls finally came down, they didn't collapse due to sudden brilliance. They collapsed due to desperation, forcing an action so profound, so devastating to the environment that we are still dealing with the consequences today. But for now, look at the timeline again. 10,000 years. 10,000 years where the most sophisticated tool was the one we already perfected. We were merely waiting, existing in the quiet, abundant stagnation of the Valley of Delay. And the valley was about to tighten its grip, ensuring that the only way forward would be through an invention that would scar the earth forever. But that's a story for the next part. First, we need to locate the epicenter of the silence. You want to locate the epicenter of human stagnation, the place where 10,000 years slipped through our fingers. You are not looking for a great desert or an empty barren wasteland? No. The Valley of Delay was, ironically, the greenest, most abundant corridor on Earth. We are talking about the Levant, that crucial, narrow land bridge sandwiched between the Mediterranean Sea and the vast, unforgiving Arabian Desert. Think of it as the ultimate pressure cooker. But for thousands of years, the pressure wasn't to invent. The pressure was to simply enjoy the incredible, predictable bounty that nature offered. Here, we meet the people who lived through the slow motion paralysis, the Natufians. When we talk about progress or delay, we are talking about them. Look at their settlements, because this is where the paradox begins. We often associate permanent homes with agriculture, right? You build a city because you have fields to tend. The Natufians shattered that timeline. They were building robust circular stone houses, miniature villages, thousands of years before they domesticated a single crop. Why? Because the food was already there, laid out like a carpet. Imagine you are standing on a hillside in what is now northern Syria or Israel 12,000 years ago. What do you see? Not the scrawny, pampered grains we eat today. You see vast, dense stands of wild emmer wheat and wild barley. These aren't scattered plants. These are fields that stretch for miles, ready for harvest. And crucially, they ripened at exactly the same time, every year. This is the brilliant, insidious trap set by the Valley of Delay. A nomadic hunter-gatherer would have to chase protein across vast territories, demanding intense physical and cognitive effort just to survive the winter. But a Natufian could spend maybe 3 or 4 weeks of intense labor, cutting, gathering, and processing those wild cereals, and secure enough carbohydrates and calories to last the entire year. They didn't need to plant them. They didn't need to till the soil. They just needed to harvest what nature provided with astounding regularity. The most sophisticated tool they needed for this task was the sickle blade, the genius invention of the previous epoch, miniaturized, perfected, and embedded in a bone or wooden handle. It was an efficiency masterpiece. It was also the ultimate roadblock. Why invest the enormous intellectual and labor energy needed to figure out how to selectively breed grain, to force it to drop its seeds only when we wanted it to, not when nature dictated, if you could just go out with your perfected sickle for 3 weeks and achieve the same result? The answer, for 10,000 years, was you wouldn't. This is why we call it the silence. It wasn't a silence of absence, it was a silence of contentment. The Natufians used their newfound free time for other things. They perfected art. They created incredible, sophisticated burials, demonstrating a clear awareness of the spiritual importance of their ancestors and their land. They had dental inlays made of bone and shell. They domesticated the dog, our first and arguably best non-human partner. They were building the foundations of culture and community, but the core technology that fundamentally alters the human relationship with the planet, food production, was stuck on repeat. They were living in high-definition comfort, ready for the next level, but the game was paused indefinitely because the easy cheat code was working perfectly. This stability, this easy guarantee, became the foundation of their entire existence. They were the first people in human history who could definitively say, "We live here permanently." They stopped moving. They sank roots. And every time a young Natufian might have had a flash of inspiration, a moment where they thought, what if we just planted the biggest seeds instead of just eating them? The predictable bounty of the next harvest would whisper back, why risk it? The valley had them hooked on comfort. This is the psychological terror of the Valley of Delay, not the struggle to survive, but the lack of necessity to excel. It's the soft captivity of the good life. But nature, as we know, has a cruel sense of humor. Because you cannot base an entire, successful, sedentary civilization on a bounty you do not control. You cannot invest so much into fixed settlements and large populations and then expect the climate to remain a gentle, generous host forever. And around 12,900 years ago, the host became hostile. Something catastrophic happened globally, something we call the Younger Dryas. It wasn't a slow cooling, it was a sudden, violent return to near-glacial conditions across the northern hemisphere. It was a slap in the face of the comfortable world. In the Levant, that meant the life-giving predictability was destroyed overnight. The temperate forests and grasslands that nurtured those dense stands of wild cereals, the very foundation of the Natufian delay, shrank drastically. The climate turned colder, drier, and radically unstable. Suddenly, that 3 weeks of harvesting wasn't enough anymore. The wild grain belts retreated to micro-refugees in steep, inconvenient valleys. The population that had grown comfortable and numerous was now facing famine, real, existential desperation for the first time in millennia. They had invested everything in not moving. Their villages were too big to abandon easily. Their societal structure was built on the localized abundance that no longer existed. They were trapped. The comfortable cradle had become a cage of stone and bone, and the only way to survive the sudden, brutal shift of the Younger Dryas was to do something they had avoided for 10,000 years of intellectual readiness. They had to break the fundamental contract with the wild world. They had to invent domestication. And that invention, The forced manipulation of nature was not born from genius. It was born from the terrible raw necessity of a people starving within sight of their ancient crumbling settlements, facing a betrayal so profound they had no choice but to permanently scar the landscape in order to survive. The walls of the valley were finally tightening, and the cost of the breakout would be the natural world itself. You have to understand the sheer, agonizing, psychological weight of that betrayal. These were the inheritors of 40,000 years of evolutionary success, people who had conquered every biome on Earth. They were smart. They had the language, the social structures, the capacity for abstract thought. And yet, the one thing that was supposed to make them safe, their comfortable, settled life built on natural abundance, had suddenly turned into a death sentence. The walls were closing in, literally. The younger Dryas didn't just turn the temperature down like a global thermostat. It specifically targeted the narrow ecological band they relied upon, the wild cereal grasses of the Levant. Those grasses required a specific, predictable seasonal pattern, the exact pattern that suddenly vanished for 1,200 agonizing years. When the snows lasted too long or the spring rains failed, the natural yield collapsed. And when the natural yield collapsed, those massive settlements, the same ones we praised earlier for showing intellectual sophistication, became anchors, dragging them into the mud. Think about the desperation, your desperation, as you watched the wild field that fed your parents' parents shrink to a pathetic, scattered patch. You can't leave. You have 80 people living in stone houses built with hard labor. You have specialized storage pits, heavy grindstones, and the graves of your ancestors right beneath the floorboards. You are shackled to the place where the food used to be. This is the true moment of intellectual delay. This is where the valley, or rather the climate change inside the valley, put a gun to humanity's head and demanded surrender. We often imagine the invention of agriculture as a brilliant aha moment, some genius realizing, hey, if I put the seed in the ground, a plant will grow. That's nonsense. They knew that already. The difference was the necessity. Before, manipulating nature was inefficient and pointless compared to letting the vast, free world feed you. Now, it was the only option. They had to take control of reproduction. And this is where the archaeological evidence gets raw and messy. When you look at the remains of the wild grains they were harvesting, the barley, the wheat, they possessed what academics call a brittle rachis. The rachis is the tiny joint that holds the kernel to the stalk. When the grain is ripe, that joint shatters instantly, scattering the seed so the plant can reproduce. That's how nature works. It ensures the plant's survival, even if it means 90% of the food falls onto the ground before you can gather it. But when you're starving, you're not thinking about the plant's reproductive strategy. You're thinking about the next meal. Imagine the harvest. They are frantically rushing the fields before the joint shatters. But every time they sweep their sickle or pull a stalk, what are they collecting? They are predominantly collecting the few kernels that didn't fall off the stalk naturally. They are collecting the ones that were slightly flawed, slightly mutated, the ones that held on a little too tightly. When those few precious kernels, the mutant hoarders, were brought back to the settlement, what happened? They were stored, they were protected, and the next year, because they were the only seeds left, they were intentionally, desperately planted. We are talking about relentless, forced, accidental genetic selection carried out under conditions of near famine for generation after generation. Within a few short centuries, a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, the local wheat populations began to change. The wild, brittle rachis was replaced by the tough rachis. The grain was now domesticated. It needed the human hand to survive. If you left that domesticated grain alone, it couldn't shatter its own stem. It couldn't spread effectively. It was utterly reliant on us, and we were utterly reliant on it. This process, This brilliant, destructive invention was not freedom. It was a trade, a tiny guaranteed yield in exchange for perpetual servitude. The moment we forced the Tafrakis into existence, the fundamental contract with the wild world was broken forever. The valley had succeeded in its mission of imprisonment. Now, instead of spending 4 hours a day hunting and gathering, enjoying intellectual and social complexity, they were spending 10 hours a day, every day, pulling weeds, clearing rocks, and guarding the fields from pests and neighbors. The work was monotonous, backbreaking, and unavoidable. They had exchanged highly varied, mentally stimulating nomadic life for relentless, repetitive drudgery. And what about the other major problem they faced? The animals. The younger Dryas didn't just shrink the grass, it reduced the large migratory herds, the gazelles and wild cattle that were their traditional protein source. These herds, faced with less food, also became smaller, skittish, and harder to find. So the same brutal logic they applied to the wheat, they applied to the animals. If the mountain sheep won't come to us, we will force them to live with us. Archaeology shows us the evidence. Sudden, massive shifts in the demographic profiles of animal bones found near settlements like Jericho or Çatalhöyük slightly later in the sequence. In the wild, you kill animals of all ages and sexes. But when you are trying to control a herd, to manage its reproduction, what do? You kill the young, aggressive males, and you keep the docile females. The animal bones found around these proto-agricultural settlements are overwhelmingly those of young males. They were selectively pruning the herd for docility and meat production. This too was born of necessity. They were bringing the stench, the disease, and the logistics of a live animal pen directly into their living space. We see sudden spikes in human disease markers and smaller stature in the skeletons from this period. We call this the Neolithic bottleneck. They were sicker, shorter, and they worked much, much harder, all so they could have a marginal, predictable calorie return. They had invented civilization's first major drawback, the permanent, exhausting schedule. You cannot leave the field. You cannot take a long vacation. You are tethered to the growth cycle, the harvest, and the storage pit. The brilliant minds of the Levant, primed for the next great leap forward, were now utterly bogged down, focused entirely on the earth beneath their feet. They had traded innovation for stability, freedom for survival. But this new, forced stability came at a horrific price. They had successfully guaranteed their survival in the narrow confines of the valley, but in doing so, they had massively multiplied the population within those confined borders. They had solved one problem, immediate starvation, only to create a dozen more. Because now there were too many people, too close together, surviving on too little variety of food, all fighting for the same piece of artificially controlled ground. And when the predictable yield inevitably failed, the famine wasn't local, it was catastrophic, killing thousands at once. The valley had trapped them, and now the people who were supposed to be building the future were about to turn their desperate ingenuity, honed by generations of constant struggle, not towards exploration, but towards the first, brutal necessity of the new world they had created. They had to learn how to defend what they owned, and they had to learn how to keep everybody else out. The forced stability they achieved, that terrible, beautiful genius we talked about, it created something we, today, find utterly unavoidable, the invention of mine. Before the valley, the concept of a massive permanent surplus was abstract. You hunted, you gathered, you shared. What you stored, you carried. But when you tie your entire existence to a field, when you spend 9 agonizing months nursing that grain, protecting it from blight, bugs, and birds, and finally you drag thousands of pounds of it back to your mud hut, that pile of grain represents your children's survival until the next harvest. It is everything. And if your neighbor's crop failed, that means their survival rests solely on your stockpile. This is the psychological pressure cooker that turned cooperation into immediate, desperate hostility. Think about that for a second, you. Imagine the terror of knowing that the famine you averted is now sitting right next door, staring hungrily at your stored wheat. The very proximity that agriculture required, people packed together to work the land efficiently, now guaranteed conflict. We had solved the problem of the environment only to create the problem of each other. And so, humanity's innovative mind, the mind that conceived of domesticating grass, of irrigating dry soil, was immediately repurposed for its most immediate and terrible necessity: defense. They had to keep people out. Go look at the archaeological record from this period, the early settlements in the Fertile Crescent, places like Jericho. Forget the biblical stories for a minute. Look at the stone. When we dig down into the layers of the early Neolithic, we don't just find houses and storage pits. We find monumental structures. We find walls, massive, terrifying walls. Walls built when stone tools were the height of technology. Walls 20 feet high, built not for protection against the elements, not just against errant wolves, but against organized, desperate human beings. People just like them. Perhaps even people from the neighboring cluster of fields less than a day's walk away. Think about the sheer, grueling effort required to organize a community to build a structure that massive. This wasn't a quick weekend project. This was years, possibly generations, of backbreaking labor, hauling limestone, stacking heavy stones, mixing tons of mud mortar. This effort was diverted entirely from farming, from inventing, from building a better life. It was dedicated to pure, paranoid exclusion. Why? Because the valley had created the first truly valuable, defensible asset: stored food. And where there is value, there must be a thief. And where there is a thief, you must build a fortress. But building a fortress requires more than just rocks and mud. It requires organization, and organization requires power. The great equalizer of the hunter-gatherer life, the fluid movement, the reliance on immediate skill, the constant sharing, all of that died the moment the first community decided to build a permanent wall. You can't build a 20-foot wall based on consensus alone. You need coordination, and crucially, you need control over the surplus that feeds the workers who aren't currently farming. This is how the old egalitarian structures crumbled. Someone, the strongest, the most charismatic, or perhaps just the person best at hoarding, had to take charge. They became the foreman, the commander, the boss. They managed the grain, and if they controlled the grain, they controlled the people. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the basic, brutal arithmetic of permanent settlement. If you need 500 people working on a fortification for 6 months instead of planting crops, someone has to tell them what to do, and someone has to guarantee their food supply. That controller is the first non-working class. They are the beginning of hierarchy, the first sign of institutionalized inequality. The valley, entrapping their bodies, had now successfully trapped their social structures. Instead of exploring the stars or inventing the wheel, their mental energy was consumed with bureaucracy, accounting, tracking who worked and who ate, and maintaining dominance. And the walls didn't just keep danger out, they kept dissent in. We have grim, undeniable evidence of what happened when these systems failed or when a neighbor looked too tempting. Archaeology of this era is littered with mass graves. We aren't talking about small skirmishes. We are talking about organized violence aimed at wiping out entire settlements, often focused specifically on capturing women and destroying men. Look at sites along the Danube, slightly later but displaying the same pattern. Entire villages brutally massacred, skulls smashed, arrows embedded in ribs. This wasn't just a fight over territory. This was a raid designed to eliminate competition, seize the stored wealth, and capture labor. The genius of farming, which was supposed to solve starvation, had instead created the concept of war as we understand it. Organized, deliberate violence over resources that could be owned and measured. The irony is agonizing. The collective intelligence of humanity had finally achieved a level of security unprecedented in our history. We could guarantee food, but that security was now a magnet for violence. We were forced to use our brightest minds not to elevate everyone, but to ensure that our small patch of prosperity remained exclusive. The valley wasn't just delaying innovation, it was fundamentally twisting the moral compass of the species. It taught us that the only way to survive the security we created was through organized exclusion and overwhelming force. They had solved the survival equation, but they had solved it only for themselves. And now, the rest of the world, those outside the dense web of the agricultural settlements, the remaining hunter-gatherers, the ones who still valued freedom over servitude to the grain, they were looking in. And they saw not a paradise, but a walled fortress holding immense, tempting wealth. The valley was about to discover that its success was its greatest threat, because the walls they built to keep the enemies out were also perfectly designed to keep everyone else, the people, the skills, the ideas, trapped inside. The pressure was mounting. The population was multiplying. The enemies were organized. And soon, the desperate, inward-looking culture of the valley would have to find a way to escape this prison of their own making, or watch their entire civilization cannibalize itself in the struggle to protect a pile of wheat. We left them trapped, didn't we? Stuck behind their own walls, choking on their own abundance. You've successfully engineered a micro-paradise, a green, fertile machine. But now you have too many moving parts, and the machine is overheating. This is the great, awful irony of the early Neolithic agricultural success. It didn't solve poverty. It industrialized it. It took the occasional starvation faced by the hunter-gatherer and replaced it with institutionalized, guaranteed malnutrition for the peasant class. You have to understand the sheer physical pressure building up in that valley. We're talking about population densities that dwarf anything that came before. More bodies mean more mouths, yes, but they also mean more waste, more communal labor required, and exponentially more disease. Archaeology doesn't just show us taller walls, it shows us the sudden, brutal spike in pathogens that come with overcrowding. Skeletons from these periods frequently tell a story of constant low-level infection, chronic stress, and shorter lifespans than the nomads outside the gates. So what did the valley innovate when faced with this internal pressure cooker? Did they invent the wheel? Did they invent metallurgy? No, they invented management. They had to. If 100 people are farming, you can manage them with handshake agreements. If 10,000 people depend on a single massive canal system running through the desert, a system that requires constant, backbreaking maintenance and precise water distribution, you need something far more robust. You need God and a ledger. The human body became the most efficient lever. Instead of investing energy in developing new technologies to save labor, they invested in developing new systems to command labor. We see the explosion of the temple economy. The priests and the nascent rulers weren't just spiritual guides. They were the first CEOs of the agrarian complex. They standardized everything. Why? Because you can't run an empire, even a proto-empire, confined to a few square miles, if Farmer A uses one measurement for barley and Farmer B uses another. They needed uniform jugs, uniform bricks, and standardized tokens for exchange. This obsessive need for central control, for accountability of every single grain of wheat and every hour of human toil, is what eventually forced the birth of writing. Writing wasn't born out of poetry or philosophy. It was born out of accounting. It was a tool of surveillance and administration designed to ensure that the harvest was properly stored and, crucially, that everyone performed their required share of ditch digging and wall repair. This is the trap tightening. The focus is entirely inward, entirely on optimizing the existing, fragile system. Every ounce of ingenuity is poured into bureaucracy and massive monolithic displays of religious control, the ziggurats. These structures weren't just places of worship. They were the central storage banks, the administrative headquarters, and the symbolic representation of absolute, unchallengeable authority. The message was clear. Your life belongs to the grain, and the grain belongs to the temple. And while the valley was perfecting the art of internal oppression, the world outside wasn't standing still. Remember the hunter-gatherers and the early pastoralists? We often dismiss them as primitives, stuck in the past, but they weren't stupid, they were pragmatic. They saw the valley not as a land of opportunity, but as a giant, stationary, soft target. Imagine being one of these people. You are tough, mobile, adapted to the sparse steppe. You watch these valley people, fat, specialized, tied to their fields, spending months building immense walls around piles of gold, which is what stored wheat effectively was. You realize their strength is also their ultimate weakness. They cannot run. They cannot scatter. They are committed to one spot. The nature of the external threat changed. It wasn't just opportunistic scavenging anymore. It became organized warfare. The nomadic groups, often controlling horses, or later early wheel technology adapted for speed, started organizing themselves precisely to exploit the weak points of the agricultural machine. They hit fast, took the surplus, and disappeared before the heavily armored, slow-moving valley soldiers could mobilize. The valley faced an impossible choice: release their human resources back to the fields, leading to famine, or create a full-time professional military force, leading to higher taxes and more authoritarian rule. Guess which one they chose? They invested in the military, but they did it valley style, through specialization and control. They poured immense resources into copper, then bronze, creating armor and weapons far beyond the scope of the nomads. They didn't just build walls, they built organized garrisons, watchtowers, and systems of swift communication using runners and later signals. The valley, the self-proclaimed center of civilization, was now effectively a siege economy. Every technological leap they made, from metallurgy to improved logistics, was driven not by the desire to free humanity, but by the frantic existential need to keep the horde protected. Their ingenuity was funneled exclusively into defense and control. They had finally created the means to push back the encroaching wilderness, but in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. They had built a culture that prioritized defense over progress, security over intellectual freedom. And we, looking back across the millennia, can see the inevitable result. When a culture becomes completely defined by what it protects and not by what it creates, stagnation is the next logical step. The people of the valley had solved survival for now. But they hadn't escaped the prison. They had only made it taller, harder, and infinitely more expensive to maintain. The only way out of a physical geographic trap is through expansion, to break the cycle of internal consumption by consuming the outside world, to stop being a besieged nation and start being an empire. But to do that, they needed something they fundamentally lacked: the ability to project overwhelming, sustained force beyond their immediate walls. The world was waiting for them to make their move, and the pressure building behind those walls was about to reach the catastrophic failure point. The valley was about to unleash itself, not because it wanted conquest, but because it had run out of room to breathe. And the consequences would reshape every corner of the ancient world. We left the valley in a terrible state of suspended animation, right? A society perfectly adapted to survival, but structurally incapable of progress. And crucially, structurally incapable of leaving. The logic is simple, but the consequences were horrific. To break out of the physical trap, they had to project force. To project force, they needed overwhelming logistics. But the valley's genius, its hyper-efficient, inward-focused bureaucracy designed only to manage the river's bounty, was fundamentally incompatible with the logistical demands of empire building. Think about what it takes to send 20,000 professional fighting men 100 miles outside the secure agricultural zone and keep them alive for 2 months. It's not just about weapons and training. It's about water, grain, replacement sandals, medical support, metal repair, messengers, and administrative oversight. Every single pound of food these soldiers consumed had to be accounted for, requisitioned from the already strained internal population, organized, labeled, packed, and transported, often across punishingly dry or mountainous terrain they were not used to traversing. This is where the stagnation hit hardest. The people of the valley had perfected managing surplus inside their borders. They had no idea how to manage scarcity outside. So, for decades, perhaps even centuries, the pressure built up internally. We are talking about critical mass. The population continues to grow. The administrative system becomes bloated and top-heavy. The resources, wood, copper, high-quality stone, are becoming expensive, often requiring dangerous expeditions just to maintain the status quo. You reach a point where every drought, every slightly low harvest, every political squabble over land rights becomes a matter of life and death for thousands. When survival itself is threatened by success, when the system can no longer feed its own population because it has run out of physical space to grow food, you have a societal heart attack. And there are only two remedies for a heart attack of this scale: revolution, internal cleansing, or expansion, external theft. The valley chose theft, but they couldn't execute it the way a normal, progressive society might, with calculated risk and sustainable goals. They were driven by desperation, and desperation rewrites the rulebook. The valley didn't launch an army. They launched a social sacrifice. The breakthrough, the terrible moment that finally allowed the valley to break the geographical lock, wasn't a technological marvel. It was the invention of a new administrative policy. Total, calculated cruelty harnessed toward external violence. You see, if you can't efficiently transport supplies to your army, you remove the need to transport supplies. You transform your army into a mobile consumption unit, a predatory engine designed to live entirely off the resources of the people it conquers. They stop carrying enormous caches of grain and start carrying a detailed administrative map of exactly where the enemy's grain is stored. This requires two things: an incredibly ruthless centralized power and an army willing to commit atrocity upon atrocity just to secure the next meal. The leader who finally harnesses this energy, let's call him the Breakthrough King, isn't a hero in any traditional sense. He's the cold-eyed accountant who understands that if he doesn't send the young men out to steal, the young men inside the walls will starve next winter. He is the first to institutionalize war, not as a political tool, but as a mandatory industrial-scale harvest. The internal cost of this shift was astronomical. To free up 20,000 men for endless campaigns outside the fertile zone, the remaining population had to surrender virtually all personal freedom. Conscription became mandatory. The bureaucracy, already complex, became terrifyingly efficient at seizing crops, levying taxes, and enforcing silence. The moment you define the existence of your state by its need to consume others, you have to fundamentally redefine your citizens as cogs in a war machine. The freedom to create, to innovate, to debate philosophy, all those things we discussed earlier, became luxuries they absolutely could not afford. The valley was focused on output, on efficiency, on survival. And survival meant war. The first few campaigns were absolute slaughterhouses. We look back at the valley's records, skeletal, fragmented, written mostly by proud, terrified scribes, and we see casualties that defy belief. They were sacrificing thousands of their own young men just to establish the first precarious toeholds outside the secure geographical zone. Why? Because the learning curve was steep and the external world fought back savagely. The surrounding tribes and city-states weren't necessarily technologically superior, but they were adaptable. They knew the land, they could fade into the mountains, and they were experts in hit-and-run warfare. The rigid, slow-moving columns of the valley's army, dependent on finding and seizing resources immediately, were often annihilated before they could complete their mission. It took immense internal political will, backed by the certainty of domestic famine, to absorb these losses and keep sending the armies out year after year. This is the birth of the valley's terrifying reputation. It wasn't the brilliance of their tactics that defined them, it was the sheer, brutal persistence driven by necessity. They weren't fighting to establish borders, They were fighting because stopping meant death by internal consumption. Every campaign was a roll of the dice. Either you bring back enough food and plunder to pay the administrative costs and feed the capital, or the capital implodes. And eventually, they started winning. They developed the ability to manage resource streams across hundreds of miles, not by innovating faster transportation technology, but by forcing the conquered populace to become the logistical infrastructure itself. They enslaved entire populations and forced them to farm, haul, and build supply depots for the next wave of invasion. The valley finally found its true purpose, the thing that broke its stagnation: organized, systematic violence. The civilization that had been defined by the protective walls of its geography was now defined by the expansionary cruelty of its armies. They had been trapped in amber for generations, and now they were liquid mercury, flowing outward, cold and heavy, across the ancient landscape. The world outside suddenly looked up, trembling. These weren't small raiding parties seeking cattle. This was a force driven by an apocalyptic internal dynamic, a force that had redefined survival as perpetual conquest. The valley wasn't seeking peace treaties, it was seeking breathing room, and it was willing to suffocate everyone else to get it. And this expansion, this necessary act of violence, brought the valley into direct, catastrophic conflict with powers they didn't even know existed, powers that had never faced anything like the pure. Desperate efficiency of a civilization finally breaking the walls of its own prison. The cost of the delay was about to be paid, and the receipt was being handed to every single corner of the ancient world. They had stopped breathing, and now we were about to suffer the exhale, when that compressed, aggressive civilization, the one we've been tracking, the one trapped by its own success and its own environment, finally hit the world. It wasn't a conventional war. It was less like a collision of two armies and more like a dam breaking onto a village built too close to the river. The outside world, the empires we know, the places that had spent centuries developing laws, art, and complex bureaucracies, didn't know how to categorize what they were seeing. They had rules of war. They fought over borders, resources, or honor. They expected sieges, formal challenges, and negotiations. The valley didn't negotiate. They needed everything. Their internal dynamic was starvation, not necessarily of food, but of space, of future, of potential. And when you are fighting an enemy whose only motivation is fundamental survival, every philosophical or tactical argument you bring to the table is instantly irrelevant. The established powers had bronze armor and massive city walls. They had sophisticated logistical tails requiring thousands of oxen and complex accounting to move their armies. They moved slowly, heavily, majestically. But the Valley Force? We know now they were terrifyingly efficient. They didn't rely on supply lines in the traditional sense. They lived off the land they took. They adapted their methods to the terrain immediately. If you had heavy infantry, they'd hit you with overwhelming mobility. If you built a giant fort, they wouldn't waste time besieging it. They would simply flow around it, cut off the water, and burn the fields that fed your city. They didn't fight wars of conquest. They fought wars of environmental depletion. If they couldn't live there, nobody would. Imagine being one of the settled soldiers, standing in your meticulously formed phalanx, waiting for the enemy standard to appear on the horizon. And then, nothing. Instead, you hear the distant pounding of hooves, not in a line, but in swirling, fragmented attacks that hit your flanks, your rear, and then vanish before your heavy, slow-moving cavalry could even turn around. They were fighting ghosts who bled very little and whose movements defied the geometric logic of organized warfare. This is the psychological advantage born from the valley's enforced simplicity. The established empires valued life, at least the lives of their elite soldiers. Retreat was a tactical choice. Surrender was an option. But for the valley warriors, retreat often meant failure. And failure meant returning to the choked, starving landscape they had just escaped. They carried the pressure of centuries of delay on their shoulders. They had nothing to lose but their chains. And what do you do when facing an enemy that accepts, even welcomes, the total annihilation of its own force if it means securing victory? We, the outside world, had forgotten how to fight purely desperate battles. Our conflicts had become rituals of power projection, not acts of absolute necessity. The consequence was catastrophic. We see it in the archaeological record, not gradual decline, but sudden, violent ruptures. Cities weren't abandoned, they were instantly incinerated. Trade networks that had crisscrossed continents for 1,000 years, bringing tin from the north and spices from the east, suddenly went silent, snapped like dry branches. Why? Because the valley wasn't interested in inheriting the current system. They were interested in surviving outside the system that had imprisoned them. And their method of survival involved shattering the delicate structure that everyone else relied on. Think about the domino effect. The great merchant powers relied on predictability. They relied on standardized roads and established laws. When the valley armies swept through, they didn't necessarily occupy the territory permanently right away, but they achieved something far more devastating. They introduced entropy. They made the roads unsafe. They made the laws meaningless. Imagine you are a king of a rich coastal kingdom. You don't even share a border with the valley, but suddenly the iron you rely on stops arriving. The grain shipments from the inland plains disappear. Your tax revenue vanishes because the people producing the wealth have either fled or been slaughtered. Your meticulously planned society, built on specialized labor and complex exchange, begins to starve. Not from the valley's direct attack, but from the simple, horrifying fact that the world has stopped making sense. The cost of the valley's delay was the shattering of global coherence. The true horror of this expansion is that the powers that suffered the most were the ones who had achieved the greatest technological and social sophistication. Those empires were too complex, too interconnected, too specialized. They were like highly engineered jets, magnificent when flying, but totally defenseless when the runway was taken away. The valley, on the other hand, was a simple, brutal rock, easily thrown, capable of shattering glass on impact. They finally broke out. They annihilated every obstacle. They conquered vast tracts of land, redefining the map and the very meaning of power in the ancient world. They had proven, beyond a doubt, that the pent-up potential of centuries of stagnation, when finally released, was the most destructive force history had ever seen. The air they needed to breathe was now secured, bought at the price of millions of foreign lives and the collapse of the known world order. But here is where the story gets truly messy, where the physics of conquest hit the reality of governing. The valley succeeded in its mission. It escaped the trap. It destroyed its enemies. And then the valley looked around at the burning ruins of the world they had just won. The lands were vast. The treasures were immense. But the established systems of management were gone. They had conquered civilization itself, but they had no instruction manual for running it. The terrible, dark irony of the Valley of Delay was about to present its final, horrifying problem. They knew how to survive. They knew how to conquer, but they never learned how to live in peace. They were now the masters of an infinitely complex system, holding the broken pieces in their hands, realizing that the survival techniques that made them invincible in war were absolutely useless in governing the silence after the screaming stopped. The trap had merely shifted its location. And this new trap was far, far more subtle. The silence after the screams is the most terrifying sound in history, isn't it? We left our valley conquerors standing on a mountain of victory, looking down at a world they had completely, irrevocably shattered. They had won the great game, But they realized too late that the rules of war are not the rules of civilization. Suddenly, the intelligence required to perfectly manage a herd of horses or to coordinate a flanking maneuver across the steppe was utterly useless when faced with the necessity of managing tax receipts from settled agriculturalists 4,000 miles away. The administrative void was instantaneous and catastrophic. Remember what the Valley taught them: efficiency, mobility, and ruthless simplification. Civilization, however, is based on bureaucracy, inertia, and infinitely complex layered specialization. Our conquerors, trained for speed, encountered the heavy machinery of civilization, and they simply did not know how to drive it. The historical facts are brutal in their simplicity. The conquerors did not invent a new way to run the world. They hired the defeated to do it for them. They depended entirely on the captured administrators, the Persian scribes, the Chinese scholars, the Uyghur bureaucrats. These were the very people whose empires they had just dismantled. Think about that stunning irony. The Valley people were the muscle, the invincible fist, but they lacked the administrative brainstem. They outsourced the mind of their empire to the people they had subjugated. This wasn't assimilation, it was administrative parasitism. And here is where the trap, subtle and deadly, closed around them for the final time. When you hold power without understanding the mechanisms of that power, you are merely a custodian waiting for the rightful owner to reclaim the keys. The defeated bureaucrats, scholars, and clergy were delighted to continue running the systems, but they ran them using their own cultural priorities, their own languages, and their own ancient traditions. The pure, simple, brutalist philosophy of the Valley, the very thing that made them invincible, was too thin to cover the enormous complexity of the lands they now ruled. They had no tradition of massive public works, no centralized currency system based on abstract value, and crucially, no stable, universally accepted succession protocol beyond raw, brute force. The moment the great leaders died, the inevitable happened. The vast empire, held together only by the charisma and terror of one generation, instantly began to fragment. This fragmentation was not merely geographical, it was intellectual. The competing successor states, the vast khanates that fractured across Eurasia, began fighting each other almost immediately. Why? Because the Valley philosophy never evolved past conquest is the highest form of governance. They never developed the civic intelligence to compromise or to share power without violence. They were caught in the self-replicating loop of their own initial success. The simple survival mechanism, perfected in the harsh environment of their origin, became a fatal cognitive limitation in the settled, rich lands they inherited. We often look at these subsequent empires, the great Khans of Persia, the dynasties of China, the Golden Hordes, and see immense cultural wealth and stability. But here is the profound, dark secret of the Valley. The stability and cultural wealth we see are not theirs. They are the adopted, appropriated, and often poorly maintained systems of the civilizations they conquered. Our conquerors became culturally assimilated by the people they had just vanquished. They melted into the Persian courts, adopted the sedentary Chinese bureaucracy, and embraced the religion of the settled people. The Valley of Delay, therefore, didn't stop humanity in a single geographical location. It created a group of people so perfectly adapted to a narrow skill set, war, movement, survival, that when they were finally successful, they had nothing left to offer the world except reorganization by destruction. Their incredible power was the ultimate historical dead end. They had the opportunity to build a unified world system, combining the knowledge of East and West, yet they lacked the administrative tools, the philosophical foundation, and the intellectual humility to do anything but sit atop the existing structures until those structures assimilated or collapsed beneath them. This is the ultimate terrifying lesson, and this is why we started this journey together, peering into the history of human failure. The valley was never a patch of desert or a frozen steppe. The valley of delay is the perfection of a single, powerful solution to the exclusion of all others. It is the human tendency to believe that because a tactic worked once, it will work forever. It is the dangerous comfort of simple answers in a world demanding complex questions. The conquerors found freedom from their initial trap, the scarcity and the harsh survival demands, only to construct an infinitely more effective trap for themselves. The trap of intellectual complacency born from overwhelming physical success. They became victims of their own specialized genius. Look around us today. Are we doing the same thing? Are we perfecting technologies, systems, or ideologies that are incredibly effective at solving one problem, while utterly unprepared for the resulting complexity they generate? Are we, right now, building our own intellectual valley of delay, relying so heavily on specialized efficiency that we forget how to manage the fundamental, messy, human process of living together? The artifacts they left behind, the fragmented empires, the destroyed cities, the temporary bridges connecting civilizations are a silent testament to this truth. Survival is a low bar. Progress is the terrifying, endless climb toward complexity. Our history shows us that the moment we stop expanding our intelligence, the moment we rely solely on what worked yesterday, we become the most dangerous thing in the universe. A species perfectly adapted for a world that no longer exists. The valley of delay is not finished with us. It waits for every generation that mistakes destruction for achievement and simplification for wisdom. And that, my friends, is the final irony. The world was conquered, but the conquerors vanished, absorbed into the complexity they were never intelligent enough to master. The world kept turning. The delay was only theirs. The story ends here.